I didn't plan on finding the cabin. I was just looking for a place to rest. I had been driving for hours, heading through the hills of West Virginia, trying to reach a hunting spot an old friend had told me about. It was early October, and the air was thick with that damp, cold bite that signaled winter wasn't too far away. The trees along the winding road had shed half their leaves, leaving the ground covered in reds and oranges. I had taken a few wrong turns along the way, and with no cell service, I was relying on an old paper map that wasn't exactly up to date. The sun had started to dip below the tree line when I realized I needed to find a place to stay the night. I wasn't about to set up camp on the side of the road, not with how unpredictable the weather could be up here. The last thing I needed was to wake up to rain and mud. Then I saw it. Tucked back in the trees, maybe 30 yards off the road, was a small wooden cabin. It was old, probably decades old, but still standing. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the walls were gray and weathered, but the structure itself looked intact. There was no sign of recent activity. No vehicle, no tire tracks, no light inside. Just a cabin, forgotten in the woods. I pulled my truck onto the narrow dirt path leading up to it and parked. I sat there for a moment, looking at the place, debating if it was a good idea. I had spent enough time in the woods to know abandoned cabins usually meant one of two things. Either it belonged to someone who still came back every now and then, or it was left alone for a reason. But I was tired, and it was getting dark. I grabbed my rifle, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and stepped out of the truck. The air smelled like damp wood and fallen leaves. The only sound was the occasional creak of branches shifting in the wind. The front door was slightly ajar. That should have been my first warning. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my boots. I pushed the door open a little more, just enough to see inside. The cabin was small, one main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a few chairs. There was a narrow doorway leading to what I assumed was a bedroom or storage area. Dust covered every surface. Cobwebs clung to the corners. It smelled stale, like it had been sealed up for years. Still, it was better than sleeping in my truck. I stepped inside, keeping my rifle in my hands just in case. The air was cool, the kind of cool that settles in a place left untouched for too long. My boots left tracks in the dust as I moved through the room, taking in the details. The furniture was old but sturdy. There was a set of metal hooks near the fireplace where pots and pans used to hang, but they were gone. The floor was made of rough wooden planks, worn smooth in some places. Then I noticed something that made me pause. The dust covered almost everything. Almost. There was a small section of the table near the fireplace where the dust had been disturbed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me that someone had been here recently. That uneasy feeling settled in my gut, the one that told me I should turn around and leave. But I ignored it. I was too tired to go looking for another spot, and I told myself that maybe some hunter had passed through a few weeks ago and used the cabin for shelter. I set my pack down by the wall and started checking the place more carefully. The bedroom was small, just a narrow cot and a wooden shelf. The mattress on the cot was covered in a thin layer of dust, and there were no blankets or personal belongings. If someone had been staying here, they hadn't left much behind. I went back into the main room and started gathering some wood from a pile near the fireplace. Whoever had used the cabin before me must have left it there, though some of the logs were so old they were starting to rot. Still, I managed to find enough dry ones to get a fire going. As the flames started to catch, filling the cabin with flickering light, I heard something outside. A soft, deliberate crunch of leaves. I froze. The fire crackled, filling the silence. I slowly reached for my rifle, keeping my movements quiet. I listened. Nothing. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer or a raccoon moving through the brush. I forced myself to relax, but the feeling didn't go away. I decided to check the door again just to be sure. I stepped onto the porch and looked around. The trees stood tall and still, their bare branches reaching into the dark sky. The moon was barely visible through the clouds. Then I saw them, footprints. They led from the trees to the edge of the porch. Fresh ones. Someone had been standing there, watching. I felt my stomach tighten. I turned quickly, scanning the treeline, my rifle raised. Nothing but shadows. The wind had died down completely, leaving the woods eerily silent. I backed into the cabin, shutting the door firmly behind me. I locked it. Not that the old wooden latch would do much good, but it was something. I sat down near the fire, my back to the wall, my rifle in my lap. I wasn't about to sleep. Not now. Hours passed. The fire burned low. My eyes grew heavy, but I forced myself to stay alert. Then I heard it again. A soft creak. Not from outside, from inside. The sound came from the bedroom. I gripped my rifle tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. Slowly, I turned my head toward the open doorway. The room was dark. The firelight barely reached past the threshold. I stood up, moving as quietly as I could. I stepped toward the doorway, raising the rifle. I took a slow breath and leaned in. The cot was empty. The shelves were empty. Then I looked down. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. Footprints.
Bare footprints.
Leading from the cot to where I stood. I spun around, my heart pounding. The cabin was small. There was nowhere for someone to hide. The door was still locked. The windows were closed. But I wasn't alone. A rush of cold air swept through the cabin as something moved behind me. I didn't think. I ran. I yanked the door open and bolted for my truck, not looking back. I heard movement. Footsteps behind me, fast and heavy. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. For a moment, everything was silent. Then something slammed against the truck. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. My headlights flooded the area in front of me. Nothing. The cabin stood there, quiet and empty. But I knew better. I slammed the truck into reverse, backing onto the road. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. I never went back. Later, I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, that I had let my mind get the best of me. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone in that cabin. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe I thought I needed the break. Maybe I didn't want to disappoint my friend. Either way, I regretted it almost immediately. Nick had been raving about his uncle's old hunting cabin for years. He always talked about how it sat deep in a valley, surrounded by dense forest, miles away from the nearest town. It sounded peaceful, and maybe at one point in my life I would have found that appealing. But now, as I stood outside the small wooden structure, staring at the warped porch and the chipped paint on the front door, I felt nothing but unease. The drive out had been bad enough. The last 30 miles were all dirt roads, winding through the woods, the type that made you feel like you'd driven off the map. My truck had rattled over potholes, and more than once, I had to slow down to avoid deer darting across the road. By the time I pulled up to the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had been dipping low in the sky, and I felt that old, familiar weight in my chest. I had never liked being alone in the woods. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a deep discomfort, like I didn't belong. Still, I told myself it was just a couple of nights. Nick would be joining me the next day after handling some work in town, and for now, I just needed to settle in. The cabin was smaller than I expected. One room, a wood stove in the corner, a tiny kitchen against the far wall. The air inside smelled like dust and old wood. I dropped my bag on the floor and went about checking the place, making sure there weren't any leaks or critters hiding in the corners. By the time I finished, The sun had fully set, and the quiet settled in. Not the normal quiet you get in the country, where insects hum and owls call in the distance. No, this was heavier, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every sound you made, every breath, every step. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and lit the old oil lamp on the table. The glow did little to make the place feel less empty. I should have gone to bed early, but instead, I sat on the edge of the old cot, listening. The wind moved through the trees outside, branches creaking. Every now and then, something shifted in the underbrush, and I told myself it was just an animal. It had to be. I didn't sleep much, maybe an hour or two at most, before I woke to the sound of something moving outside. First, I thought it was just the wind again, but then I heard it, footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the walls of the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Then they stopped, right outside the door. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the dark shape of the door. I didn't hear anything else, and eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe a deer, maybe a branch falling. The next morning, I stepped outside, squinting in the pale sunlight. The dirt in front of the door was smooth.
No footprints.
No signs of anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I spent the day trying to keep myself busy. I chopped wood. I walked the perimeter of the clearing. The trees felt too close, the air too still. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. I was out here alone. That night it happened again. The footsteps came later, long after I had shut off the lamp. I lay in the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening. This time they didn't stop at the door. They moved around the cabin, slow, circling. I felt my pulse in my throat. I told myself to move, to grab my rifle, to do something, but I stayed frozen, listening. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, they were gone. I didn't sleep after that. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Nick could have his weekend trip to himself. I wasn't going to sit around waiting to see who or what was lurking out there at night. I packed up fast, stuffed my gear into my bag, grabbed my keys and stepped outside, only to stop dead in my tracks. There were footprints in the dirt.
Bare footprints.
They led from the edge of the trees, circled the cabin, and then stopped right in front of the door. I stared at them, my breath coming fast. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been out here, watching. I turned for my truck, throwing my bag in the passenger seat, my hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, sputtered, and then died. I swore under my breath and tried again. Nothing. Popping the hood, I climbed out, my stomach twisting into knots. I wasn't a mechanic, but even I could see the problem. The wires had been cut. I slammed the hood shut and looked around. The trees stood silent. The clearing felt too open, like something was just beyond the tree line, watching. I had two choices: stay in the cabin and wait for Nick to show up tomorrow, or start walking. I grabbed my pack and started down the dirt road. Felt like the longest walk of my life. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something, someone, stepping out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the wind, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, the distant cry of some bird. I walked for miles. The sun dipped lower, the sky turning gold and pink. I knew the main road had to be close. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the road ahead. I stopped cold. They were too far away for me to make out details. Just a dark shape standing perfectly still. I took a step forward. They didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. My mouth felt dry. I gripped the straps of my bag tighter and forced myself forward. With every step, the figure became clearer. A man. Tall, thin, wearing nothing but ragged clothes. His feet were bare, and he was smiling. Not moving, just standing there, smiling. I stopped again, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't say anything. I just turned and started walking the other way. I didn't run, not at first, but when I glanced back, he was closer. I started running. The trees blurred past me, branches whipping at my arms, my breath ragged. My legs ached, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I don't know how long I ran before I saw the headlights. A truck. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms, gasping for breath. The truck skidded to a stop, and I barely registered the driver's face before I was yanking the door open, throwing myself inside. "Drive," I said. "Now." The man, some old farmer, I think, looked confused but did as I said. I didn't look back. I never told Nick the full story, just said the cabin wasn't for me. But I know what I saw, and I know deep down that if I had stayed another night, I wouldn't have made it out. I didn't want to stay there. I didn't even want to get out of the truck when I first saw the place. But when you're desperate, when the only real options are between a rough night and an even worse one, you take what you can get. It was October 2013. I had just turned 32. My life wasn't exactly going as planned, and this trip was meant to be some sort of reset. I had quit my job after realizing I hated it, packed up whatever I could fit in the back of my old Ford, and decided to drive until I figured out what was next. It sounded like a good idea at the time, just go see the country, find a place that felt right. Somewhere in northern Michigan, I had made the mistake of taking a backroad shortcut through the woods. The map on my phone showed a quick way to cut across to the highway, but I hadn't accounted for how rough the roads would get. After miles of winding gravel paths, thick forests closing in on either side, my truck started acting up. A horrible grinding noise under the hood, a sharp lurch to the side every time I hit a rut. I pulled over in front of the only sign of civilization I'd seen for miles. A rotting wooden sign half covered in moss, reading Black Hollow Cemetery in faded white paint. Just beyond the sign, an old cabin sat at the edge of the woods, barely visible through the thick trees. The place looked abandoned. The front porch sagged under the weight of its own decay, the single window in front covered in dust and grime. But it was shelter, and I didn't exactly have another option. I checked my phone, no signal. The nearest gas station had to be at least 20 miles back. Walking wasn't an option, not with night closing in and a cold wind picking up. I figured I could stay the night, try to fix the truck in the morning. Maybe whoever owned the cabin was still around. Maybe I could use their phone. The front door was unlocked. It groaned as I pushed it open, dust swirling in the air from the movement. Inside, it was dark, the only light coming from the last glow of the evening sun leaking through the cracks in the wood. There wasn't much, just a single wooden chair, a small table, and a fireplace filled with old ashes. The place smelled like damp wood and something else, something stale. I shut the door behind me and let my eyes adjust. The walls were bare except for deep scratches running along the lower panels, like something had clawed at them repeatedly. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped further inside, my boots kicking up dirt from years of neglect. I tried not to think too much about what the place had been used for. Maybe it was an old caretaker's cabin for the cemetery. Maybe it was just someone's hunting lodge, abandoned when the roof started leaking. Either way, it wasn't mine, and I wasn't about to start making myself comfortable. I just needed to get through the night. I dropped my bag on the table and sat down in the chair, rubbing my hands together for warmth. The wind outside had picked up, whistling through the trees, rattling the loose boards on the walls. The whole cabin groaned under the pressure, as if it was struggling to stay upright. Then I heard it, a single thud against the back wall. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It had been soft, almost like something had fallen against the wood. An animal, maybe, A tree branch knocked loose by the wind. Then another thud, harder this time. It wasn't random. It wasn't the wind. Something was outside. I stood up slowly, straining my ears, listening for any movement. The wind howled, drowning out anything else. I glanced at the fireplace. Empty, no firewood. If I had to defend myself, I had nothing. The thudding stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then I heard a slow, dragging sound along the side of the cabin. It scraped against the wood, moving from the back wall to the side, then stopping just beneath the window. I didn't move. I couldn't see out the window. It was too grimy, too dark. But I could feel it, the presence of something just outside, waiting. Then, a low creak as the front porch sagged under weight. Something had stepped onto the porch. I backed up slowly, heart pounding. The doorknob rattled. Not violently, not like someone trying to force their way inside. Just testing it, gently turning it back and forth. I held my breath. Then silence. Minutes passed. The wind still howled, but nothing moved. I waited, ears straining, staring at the door. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard slow, heavy footsteps retreating back into the trees. I didn't sleep. I stayed in that chair, gripping my pocket knife, barely blinking. Every sound outside made my stomach tighten. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional thump of something in the distance. By the time the sun started to rise, I was already packing up my bag. I cracked the door open, peering outside. The ground was covered in thick, wet leaves, but there, just beyond the porch, leading toward the woods, were deep footprints.
Bare footprints.
They were large, too big for any normal person. The steps were uneven, like whoever or whatever had been out there wasn't walking normally. I didn't stick around to investigate. I made my way back to my truck, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. By some miracle, the engine sputtered to life. The grinding noise was still there, but I didn't care. I threw it into reverse, spinning the tires in the mud as I tore out of there, not looking back. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to know. All I know is if you ever find yourself near Black Hollow Cemetery and you see that old cabin at the tree line, don't stop. Keep driving. The rain had been falling since the early morning, a steady, unbroken sheet of water that turned the dirt roads into mud and the trees into dripping, skeletal figures. I had driven up here alone, planning to spend a few days away from everything. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to an old friend who barely used it anymore. He had told me I could come up whenever I wanted, as long as I didn't mind roughing it a little. It was late October, and the air had a sharp bite to it. The wood stove inside was my only real source of warmth, and I had spent most of the morning stacking wood on the covered porch, making sure I had enough to last through the night. The roof of the cabin was metal, and the rain pounded against it like a drum, a constant hum that filled the silence. I had parked my truck a short walk away, near the main dirt road. The ground was soft and slick, and I didn't want to risk getting stuck out here. There was no cell service, no landline, and the nearest neighbor was probably a couple of miles away. I wasn't worried. I had enough food, water, and firewood to get through the next few days. As the afternoon stretched on, the light outside started to fade. The rain hadn't let up for a second. It was relentless, turning everything outside into a blur of gray and black. The trees swayed in the wind, their wet trunks gleaming in the dim light. I stood by the window, watching the forest, listening to the rain hammer against the glass. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle. I almost didn't notice it. I had gone outside to grab another load of firewood from the stack on the porch when I saw it. A single footprint in the mud, right at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't mine. I had been careful to step on the wooden planks leading up to the cabin, avoiding the mud as much as possible. This footprint was deep, fresh, and pointed towards the steps, as if someone had walked right up to the cabin. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. The rain was coming down hard, and already the edges of the footprint were beginning to blur, filling with water. If I had waited even a few more minutes, I might not have noticed it at all. I glanced around, scanning the tree line. The woods were thick, dark, shifting with the wind. I didn't see anyone, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Trying to push down the unease crawling up my spine, I grabbed the wood and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin was small, just one main room with a bed in the corner, a little kitchen area, and a wood stove. The bathroom was an outhouse a short walk away, which I was starting to regret. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of stepping outside in the dark. I threw a couple of logs into the stove, stoking the fire. The warmth helped, but it didn't shake the feeling that had settled deep in my chest. Someone had been here recently. I sat down at the small wooden table, listening to the rain. It was louder now, almost deafening. The wind was picking up, making the trees groan. I thought about checking outside again, but I didn't want to. Not yet. An hour passed, then another. The rain never slowed. I was about to call it a night when I heard it. A sound from outside. Not the wind, not the rain. Something else. A shuffle. A footstep. I froze, my heart pounding. It was close, right outside the cabin. I stood up slowly, moving towards the window. The glass was fogged up from the heat inside, but I could still see the vague outline of the porch. Something moved. A shadow. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and clicked it on, aiming the beam outside. Nothing. Just the rain, the trees, the empty porch. I let out a slow breath, but the unease didn't leave me. My fingers tightened around the handle of the flashlight. I wasn't imagining things. I had heard something. I waited, listening, but the only sound was the storm. Eventually, I turned off the flashlight and stepped away from the window. I needed to sleep. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the wind. I didn't believe that. I grabbed my rifle from where I had leaned it against the wall earlier, just in case. Lying in bed, I kept the gun within reach. The rain kept falling, and the wind howled against the cabin walls. At some point, I drifted off. I woke up to silence. The rain had stopped. The wind was gone. The only sound was my own breathing. I sat up, blinking in the darkness. Something felt wrong. The kind of wrong you can't explain, just sense. Then I heard it. The slow creak of the porch. My blood ran cold. Someone was out there, standing on the porch. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tightly. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The porch creaked again. A slow, careful step. I wanted to look. I wanted to check the window, but I couldn't. Then the doorknob turned. A slow, deliberate twist. It was locked. I sat there, gripping the gun, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would shake the walls. The knob rattled again, harder this time. Then silence. I didn't move. I waited, listening. And then, just as slowly as it had started, the sound of footsteps. Moving away. I stayed like that for hours, too afraid to move. I didn't sleep. The rain started up again, light at first, then heavier, masking whatever sounds might have been out there. When the first hint of daylight crept through the trees, I finally stood up. I moved to the window, heart pounding. The mud outside was covered in footprints. They led from the tree line to the porch, stopping at the door. Then they trailed back, disappearing into the woods. I packed my things in less than 10 minutes. By the time I got to my truck, the rain was coming down hard again. I didn't care. I drove as fast as I could down the muddy road, not stopping, not looking back. I didn't tell my friend what had happened. I just told him I wouldn't be using the cabin again. And I never did. It was the middle of October, the kind of season where the air carried the first bite of winter, but the trees still clung to the last of their golden leaves. I had taken a few days off work to get away from everything. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. The plan was simple. Drive up to a remote cabin in Montana, spend a few nights hunting, and clear my head before the snow made the back roads impossible. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to an old friend, Matt, who had moved away years ago. He'd given me the keys and told me I could use it whenever I wanted. It was a small place, nothing fancy. One room, a wood stove, and a cot. No electricity, no running water. Just enough to get by. I liked it that way. I wanted to be alone. The drive out was rough, a long stretch of dirt road winding through thick pines. The deeper I went, the less the outside world seemed to exist. No houses, no cars, no people, just the sound of my tires crunching over gravel and the occasional rustling of something moving in the trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low. I parked my truck out front, grabbed my gear, and unlocked the door. Inside, everything was the way I remembered. A few old chairs, a rough wooden table, and a stack of firewood beside the stove. The cot was still covered with the same wool blanket Matt had left years ago. I dropped my pack, set my rifle against the wall, and got to work. I gathered some kindling, got a fire going in the stove, and filled a lantern with fuel. The air inside warmed up quickly, pushing back the cold creeping in through the cracks. That night, I sat by the fire, eating a can of beans straight from the tin. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trees. It was the kind of silence that wasn't really silence, where you could hear every little thing. The shifting of branches, the scurrying of something small across the ground, the occasional distant call of an animal I couldn't place. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest. That's what I had come out here for, after all. To be away from everything. To be alone. But then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A sound. Distant. Low. It didn't belong. At first, I thought it was an animal. Coyote, maybe. But it wasn't right. It wasn't a howl or a yip or anything I had heard before. It was slow, drawn out, almost human. But wrong. Twisted. Like someone trying to speak but not quite knowing how. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The wind outside had died down. The fire in the stove crackled softly, casting flickering light across the walls. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I reached for my rifle, not because I thought I would need it, but because it made me feel better to have it in my hands. I stood slowly, moving toward the window. The glass was old and dirty, but I could still see out into the trees. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the ground. Then I saw it, something standing just beyond the tree line, still, watching. My first thought was that it was a person, a man maybe, but that didn't make sense. No one else should be out here, not this far into the woods, not this late. I squinted, trying to make out the details. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs were long, almost stretched. Its head tilted slightly, like it was listening. And then, before I could react, it moved. Not like a person. Not like anything I had ever seen. It was fast, too fast. 1 second it was there, the next it was deeper in the trees, barely a shadow against the darkness. I stepped back from the window, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I forced myself to think, to stay calm. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe the firelight was playing tricks on my eyes. But then I heard it again. That sound. Low, drawn out. And this time it was closer. I locked the door, checked the window latches, made sure my rifle was loaded. Then I waited. The hours dragged by, the fire burning lower. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. I knew something was out there, watching, waiting. At some point, exhaustion took over. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the first light of dawn was creeping through the windows. I barely slept the next night, or the night after that. Every evening, as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt it out there, moving, watching. It never came close enough for me to see clearly, never made a sound I could place, but it was there. By the fourth night, I had enough. I packed my things before the sun even set, threw everything into the truck, and started the long drive back. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away. When I finally reached town, I told myself I had imagined it, that I had been alone too long, that my mind had played tricks on me. But even now, late at night, when the wind is still and the world is quiet, I can hear it. That sound, low, drawn out, waiting. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. It wasn't anything special, just a weekend at a remote cabin in the mountains, a place far away from work, responsibilities, and people in general. I needed that kind of isolation. Life had been too much lately, and I wanted the quiet more than anything else. The cabin was an old rental I found through a small website, not one of those big-name rental sites, but a lesser-known one that had a list of privately owned places deep in the wilderness. This one was about 20 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest with a narrow dirt road leading up to it. I liked that it wasn't one of those modernized cabins with Wi-Fi and satellite TV. It was basic, wooden walls, an old fireplace, a small generator for electricity, and a well for water. That was it. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The drive up was peaceful. The further I got from town, the less I saw of other people. Eventually, the paved road turned into gravel, and after a while, that turned into dirt. It had rained a few days before, so some parts of the road were muddy, but my truck could handle it. I didn't see another vehicle the whole way up. I arrived just before sunset. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Small, worn but sturdy, sitting in a clearing with tall pines surrounding it. There was a fire pit outside, a stack of old firewood, and a small porch with a single rocking chair. Felt perfect. I unloaded my things, mostly just a backpack with clothes, some food, and basic camping gear. I wasn't planning on doing much. Maybe some reading, hiking during the day, and just enjoying the stillness at night. I lit a fire outside, cooked some simple food, and sat there listening to the woods as the sun disappeared behind the trees. It was around then that I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Just beyond the tree line, where the woods started to get thick, there was a figure. A woman. She was standing there, half hidden by the trees, barely visible in the dim light. My first thought was that maybe she was a hiker who had lost her way. But something about her posture, the way she just stood there, still and silent, didn't sit right with me. I didn't call out to her. I just watched. My fire crackled, the only sound breaking the silence, and after what felt like too long, she turned and walked deeper into the trees. I didn't follow her. I told myself that maybe she was just passing through, that it wasn't my business, but something about it didn't feel right. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to push it out of my mind. The night was quiet, and I slept fine. But in the morning, when I stepped outside, I saw footprints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They were small, barefoot, leading from the trees to the spot where she had been standing the night before. And then they disappeared back into the woods. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had been camping nearby. Maybe she was just a local who liked to walk the woods barefoot. I tried not to let it bother me. The day was peaceful. I went for a hike, found a small stream, and spent most of the afternoon just enjoying being disconnected. But as the sun started to set again, I felt uneasy. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see her standing there again. I told myself I was being paranoid. But that night, I locked the doors and windows before I went to bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know what had woken me at first. The cabin was silent, but as I lay there, heart pounding for no reason, I heard it. The faint sound of something moving outside. Slow, careful steps on the wooden porch. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps were light, almost hesitant, but they were there. A soft creak as weight shifted on the old wood. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. A soft, deliberate scratching on the door. Not knocking, scratching. Light, slow, like fingernails dragging over the wood. I stayed in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, every muscle in my body tense. I had a hunting knife in my bag, but I didn't move to get it. I just listened. The scratching went on for what felt like an eternity. Then silence. No retreating footsteps, no sound of movement, just silence. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, waiting for something more, but nothing came. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the window, and I finally found the courage to move. I grabbed the knife and eased toward the door. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I looked through the small window next to it. The porch was empty, but the wood on the door was marked. Long, thin scratches running down the center, like someone had traced their fingers over it over and over again. I packed my things immediately. I didn't care if I had rented the cabin for another night. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. As I loaded my truck, I glanced toward the woods one last time. She was there, standing just beyond the tree line, watching, still silent, unmoving. I didn't wait. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, surrounded by signs of normal life again. I never reported it. What would I even say? That a barefoot woman stood outside my cabin and scratched my door in the middle of the night? Sounded insane. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. And I knew I would never go back. I don't know why I took the job. Maybe I wanted the solitude, or maybe I just needed to get away from everything familiar. It was the spring of 2015 when I left the city and took the offer from an old acquaintance, Jacques, who needed someone to look after his remote hunting cabin in the Jura Mountains while he was away on business. I had never done anything like that before, living alone miles from the nearest town, but it felt like something I needed. The drive there was long, winding through endless stretches of forested hills. The mountains were thick with pine, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and moss. It had rained earlier that day, and the roads were still damp, making my tires hum against the pavement. The last stretch was a dirt road, barely wide enough for my car, the trees closing in on both sides like they wanted to swallow me whole. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly how I imagined it. Aged wood, a slanted roof covered in damp leaves, and a stone chimney that had clearly seen years of use. There was a small porch with a single wooden chair, the kind that creaked under any weight. A shed stood a few meters to the side, its door slightly ajar, revealing stacked firewood and rusted tools. I let myself in with the key Jacques had given me. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust, but it was warm. The furniture was simple, just a table, a few chairs, a sagging couch, and a bed pushed against the far wall. There was no electricity, only a few old oil lamps and a wood-burning stove for heat. A single bookshelf stood in the corner, filled with old hunting magazines and a few dog-eared novels. Jacques had stocked the place with enough supplies to last me a few weeks. Canned goods, dried meat, and bags of rice. A few bottles of water sat on the counter, but he had warned me that I'd need to collect fresh water from the nearby stream. I settled in quickly, unpacking my bag and lighting one of the oil lamps as the sun dipped below the tree line. The first night was uneventful, just the sounds of the forest pressing in from all sides. I had always thought the woods would be silent, but they weren't. There was always something moving, rustling in the undergrowth, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of tree branches in the wind. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed something strange. I had gone to bed early, my body still adjusting to the absolute darkness of the forest. No streetlights, no distant hum of cars, just blackness and the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the trees. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest. But then I realized what had pulled me from sleep. There was a noise outside. At first, it was faint, almost like footsteps, but not quite. A soft, shuffling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I held my breath, listening. Could have been an animal, a deer, maybe, or a fox. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Deliberate, slow. I sat up, straining my ears. The sound moved around the cabin, stopping near the front porch. My heart pounded. I reached for the old hunting knife Jacques had left on the table and crept toward the window. The porch was empty. The forest beyond was a wall of black, the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. I stayed there for a long time, waiting, but whatever it was had moved on. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination or some animal passing through. I went back to bed, though it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next day, I checked the ground around the cabin. The soil was damp from the rain, and there were tracks, deep impressions in the mud. But they weren't from any animal I recognized. They were human, barefoot. I told myself it was old, that maybe Jacques had walked around barefoot at some point, but something about them felt fresh. The edges were crisp, not softened by rain or wind, and they led away from the cabin, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. That night, I locked the door. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was overreacting. But when night fell, the unease returned. The sounds came again, soft, deliberate movements outside the cabin. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the oil lamp and the knife and moved toward the window. Nothing, but then a shadow, just at the edge of the tree-line, a figure standing perfectly still between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. The lamp flickered in my hand, casting unsteady light across the clearing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night, barefoot? I wanted to believe it was a hunter, maybe a lost hiker, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I barely slept that night, and when morning finally came, I felt the exhaustion deep in my bones. I stepped outside, my hands trembling slightly as I checked the area. The footprints were back, fresh ones this time, circling the cabin. Whoever it was had walked around my home, stopping at the windows, the porch, watching. I needed to leave. I packed my things, stuffing my bag with as much as I could carry. I didn't care about Jacques' supplies. I'd pay him back later. I just wanted to get out. But when I stepped onto the porch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single footprint, right at the doorstep, and next to it, my car keys. I hadn't lost them. They had been inside the cabin the whole time, sitting on the table. Someone had been inside while I slept. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys and sprinted to the car, throwing my bag into the back seat. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides of the car as I sped through the forest. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my heart hammering against my ribs. I never told Jacques the full story, just that I had left early, that I wasn't cut out for that kind of isolation. He seemed disappointed but didn't press me for details. I don't know who or what was out there in those woods, but I know one thing for certain. I wasn't alone, and they wanted me to know it. It was early December when we got the orders. The four of us had been working in counter-surveillance operations for a while, mostly in cities, tracking high-value targets, gathering intelligence, and making sure threats never reached the public. But this mission was different. It was in the middle of nowhere. The orders were clear. A small group had been operating out of a cabin in a remote forest in northern Europe, off-grid, unseen, and dangerous. They were involved in something we weren't told about, but it didn't matter. Our job wasn't to ask questions. We were to confirm their presence, assess any security measures, and, if necessary, eliminate the threat. We flew out of a quiet military base, landed at a smaller airfield, and from there it was all ground travel. A single truck took us deep into the forest, where we were dropped off with our gear. From that point, it was all on foot.
No trals, no maps.
Just the coordinates we were given and the sound of wind moving through the trees. The four of us, me, Carter, Levins, and Stokes, moved through the dense forest with trained silence. Snow covered the ground in patches, making every step a balance between staying quiet and keeping traction. The cold was biting, but we were used to worse. By nightfall, we had eyes on the cabin. It was exactly as described, a small wooden structure, no larger than a single-story house, sitting in a clearing. There was a truck parked outside, old but maintained. The chimney let out a weak trail of smoke, barely visible in the freezing air. We spotted one figure through a window moving inside. No other visible movement. We set up camp a few hundred meters away, out of sight. The night passed in shifts, each of us keeping watch, rifles ready. The forest was unnervingly silent, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own breathing too much. At dawn, we made our approach. We circled the cabin, keeping low, watching for tripwires, cameras, anything that would suggest they knew we were there. Nothing. The place was too quiet. It didn't sit right. Stokes, our best shot, took a position covering us from a ridge while the three of us closed in. Carter moved up first, pressing against the wall near the only door. Levins took the back corner. I kept an eye on the windows. Then we heard it, movement inside. Heavy boots on wooden floors. Then a chair scraping against the floorboards. We froze. Then, just as quickly as it started, the movement stopped.
No voices, no sounds.
Just silence again. Carter signaled. We stacked up at the door. He reached for the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open an inch, then two, just enough to see inside. Darkness. The windows were covered, the light barely seeping through the cracks. I saw a table, a few chairs, a rifle leaning against the wall. Then the smell hit me. Metallic, stale, blood. Carter pushed the door open further. The first thing we saw was the body. A man, sitting at the table, head slumped forward, a dark pool beneath him. A gun was on the table in front of him, a single round in the chamber.
Suicide?
We stepped in cautiously, weapons raised, checking every corner. The cabin was small, one room, a fireplace, a kitchen area, and a doorway leading to what was probably a storage space. The walls were bare except for a few maps, pinned up with notes scribbled in a language I didn't recognize. I moved toward the maps. Levins cleared the storage room. Then I heard it. Levin's breathing changed. Sharper. Alert. I turned. Another body. This one in the corner of the small storage space. Slumped against the wall. Same as the first, head down, blood pooled beneath. Two men. Dead. No signs of struggle. No bullet holes in the walls. Something was off. Levin stepped back, his boot touching something soft. The third body. 3 dead men. No signs of forced entry.
No struggle. No defensive wounds.
Just dead. I looked at Carter. He had the same expression I did. This wasn't right. Stokes' voice came through the radio. Movement outside. We froze. Carter signaled toward the windows. I moved first, peering out through a crack in the boarded-up glass. Nothing. Just trees. Snow. Stillness. Then I saw it. A shape, too far to make out details. A man standing at the edge of the clearing, just at the tree line. Not moving, just watching. Then he was gone. 1 second he was there. The next he wasn't. I pulled back from the window. My breathing was slow, controlled, but my pulse was hammering. Carter signaled. We had to leave. Levins stepped back into the storage room to check the bodies one last time. Then the sound hit us. A sharp, scraping noise, metal against wood. From beneath the floorboards, all of us turned at once. Came again. Not movement, a dragging sound. Carter yanked Levins back, raising his rifle. I aimed at the floor. Then it stopped. Silence. Levins moved fast, pulling back the old rug covering the wood planks. His gloved hands found the edges of a hatch. A hidden door. We had a choice. Leave, call it in, or go deeper. Carter made the choice for us. He pulled the hatch open. Darkness below. A wooden ladder leading down. A faint smell of damp earth and something else. Something rotten. We didn't hesitate. One by one, we descended. The air was thick, cold. The walls were dirt, packed tight, leading down into a tunnel. It stretched forward just high enough for us to move crouched. Our rifles lit the way. Footprints, old ones, leading deeper. Then the tunnel opened into a small underground space. Wooden beams held up the dirt ceiling. A single lantern, long burned out, sat on a crate, and in the center of the space, a chair, with ropes still tied around it. Whoever had been down here had been restrained. Carter moved forward first. I checked the walls. More maps pinned to the beams. Notes scribbled in the same foreign language. Then Levins muttered something under his breath. He was looking at the ground, at the fourth body. This one was different. Face contorted in a silent scream, eyes wide open, mouth stretched, as if the last moments had been nothing but pure terror.
No wounds.
No signs of violence, just dead. Something felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. Carter pulled out his radio. Static. Then a voice, not ours. A whisper. One word. Run. The radio cut out. We moved. Fast. Out of the tunnel. Up the ladder. Through the cabin. Out into the freezing air. And then we heard it. The sound of something moving beneath the floorboards. Not footsteps. Not human. We ran. Through the trees. Toward the ridge. Toward Stokes. By the time we reached him, he had already seen it. Or what was left of it. The cabin. Burning. Flames rising fast. Consuming the wood. Erasing everything. The bodies. The tunnel. The maps. Everything. Gone. We stood there, catching our breath, watching the fire spread. Then Stokes said it. There was someone else. We turned to him. He shook his head. Not one of us. Someone else was there, watching. He didn't say anything else. We didn't ask. We left. The mission was marked inconclusive.
No survivors.
No intelligence recovered. And we never spoke of it again. Because whatever had been in that cabin, whatever had been watching us, it was still out there. And it had let us leave. I still remember the way the rain felt that night, the cold pressing through my jacket, soaking my sleeves, the wind biting through the trees. The smell of damp earth, wet wood, and pine needles filled the air, thick and heavy. The headlights of my truck barely cut through the darkness as I navigated the narrow, muddy road leading deeper into the woods. The cabin was still a few miles out, and I was already regretting this trip. It wasn't my idea. It was my cousin Mark's. He'd bought the cabin a few years back, a rundown place buried deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. He'd been fixing it up bit by bit, dragging me along when he needed an extra set of hands. It wasn't a bad place, quiet, isolated, but something about it always made me uneasy. Mark couldn't make it this time. His kid was sick, and he didn't want to leave his wife alone to deal with it. I understood, but since we'd already planned the trip, he asked me to go anyway, check on the place, make sure no animals had gotten inside, maybe chop some firewood. I said yes because it was easier than arguing. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the rain had turned the ground into thick, sucking mud. The truck's tires skidded as I pulled up beside the porch, the wipers dragging across the windshield, struggling to keep up with the downpour. The cabin was dark, only the faint outline visible against the trees. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. The woods were pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt like a weight pressing down. I flicked on my flashlight, grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, and stepped out. The wooden steps creaked under my boots as I climbed onto the porch. The lock was stiff from the cold, but after a few tries, the door swung open with a groan. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and damp fabric. I swept the flashlight over the room, same as I'd left it last time. A few chairs, a table, the wood-burning stove, the narrow cot against the far wall. Everything covered in a fine layer of dust. I set my bag down, shrugged off my wet jacket, and got to work. First, I checked the windows. All locked. No signs of broken glass or animal tracks. I moved to the back door, rattled it to be sure, then did a quick sweep outside with the flashlight. Just trees, rain, and darkness. Back inside, I stacked some wood in the stove and got a fire going. The crackling flames did little to push back the cold, but at least it was something. I pulled a chair close, stretched out my legs, and let the heat soak in. That's when I heard it. A sound, faint but clear over the rain. Something moving outside. I sat up, holding my breath. The wind howled through the trees, branches groaning under the weight of the storm. I told myself it was just that, the wind, the rain, maybe a raccoon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I grabbed the flashlight and stood, moving toward the window. I kept the beam low, sweeping it across the clearing. Nothing but mud and grass. The truck sat where I'd left it, rainwater streaming down its sides. Beyond that, just the dark tree line. I waited, listening. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I moved back to the chair, but I didn't sit. Instead, I pulled the rifle from where it rested against the wall. I wasn't expecting trouble, but out here, you never knew. I checked the chamber, made sure it was loaded, and set it within reach. The night dragged on, the rain hammering against the roof in waves. I dozed in and out, the fire casting flickering shadows against the walls. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Closer this time. A footstep. I was fully awake in an instant. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and pointed it at the window. The beam cut through the glass, illuminating the clearing. And that's when I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the trees, standing there, not moving. I froze. The flashlight trembled in my grip, the beam wavering. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing something dark. The rain made it hard to see any details, but I could tell they were facing me, watching. I reached for the rifle, my fingers closed around the stock, my heart pounding. I told myself it was a hunter, maybe a lost hiker, but deep down I knew that wasn't right. No one came out here, not in the middle of the night, not in a storm like this. I kept the light trained on the figure, waiting for them to move, to call out, to do anything. They didn't. Minutes passed. The fire crackled behind me. The rain drummed against the roof. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they turned, walked back into the woods. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, but I didn't relax. If anything, my grip tightened on the rifle. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire, gun in my lap, staring at the door. Every creak, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was over, that whoever it was had left. But that didn't explain why they were here in the first place. The night stretched on, endless. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I was already on my feet, packing my bag. I wasn't staying. Whatever Mark needed me to do could wait. I stepped onto the porch, the cold morning air biting through my clothes. The ground was a mess of mud and rainwater, my boot prints visible from the night before. But as I turned toward the truck, my stomach twisted. There were more prints now, leading up to the porch, stopping just outside the door. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there, standing just feet away while I sat inside, unaware. I didn't wait to think about it. I climbed into the truck, fired up the engine, and tore down the muddy road, not looking back. I never went back to that cabin after that. Mark still owns it, still goes out there when he gets the chance. But I told him if he ever needs anything from it, he's on his own. I didn't want to go. The whole thing was a favor, something I agreed to months back without thinking too much about it. A buddy of mine, Eric, had bought a small cabin way up in the mountains of Washington state, close to the Canadian border. The place was old and falling apart, but he got it for dirt cheap and planned on fixing it up himself. He worked construction, so he knew what he was doing, but he had a tight schedule and could only work on it a little at a time. That's where I came in. He asked if I could check on it while he was away, just to make sure nobody was messing with it. He wasn't worried about squatters, too remote for that, but bears, weather damage, and even small-time thieves could be an issue. The cabin still had some tools inside, and he didn't want them getting stolen. I had some time off work, so I said yes, figuring it'd be a quiet weekend alone. It wasn't. The road up to the cabin was rough, just a dirt path cutting through thick trees, barely wide enough for my truck. It had been raining earlier, and the mud made it slow going. I could hear my tires struggling, spinning a little before finding grip. The trees leaned in close, branches scraping the sides of the truck, and I had to keep my headlights on even though it wasn't dark yet. The canopy was so thick that barely any sunlight made it through. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw the cabin sitting there, half-built. The walls were up, but some parts were still exposed to the elements. The roof looked solid, but there was a stack of shingles off to the side, meaning it probably wasn't completely finished. A blue tarp covered part of the structure, flapping slightly in the wind. A small porch had been added, though it was just a frame of unfinished wood, no railings yet. I stepped out of the truck and stretched, taking in the cold mountain air. It was quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just my own breathing and the sound of my boots crunching on wet gravel. The door was unlocked, just like Eric said it would be. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell: wood, dust, and something damp. The floor was covered in sawdust, and a few tools were scattered across a workbench. There was no furniture yet, just a couple of camping chairs and an old mattress on the floor. I dropped my bag near the door and checked my phone. No signal. I wasn't surprised. Eric warned me about that. The plan was simple. I'd stay the weekend, keep an eye on the place, and head back Sunday morning. I had food, water, and a battery-powered lantern. I wasn't worried about anything. That changed the first night. I woke up to a sound outside, a soft rustling, like someone or something was moving through the trees. I sat up, listening. The wind had picked up, making the tarp outside flap louder, but that wasn't what I heard. This was lower to the ground, heavier. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it toward the window. The glass was old and slightly fogged up, but I could see the trees swaying. Nothing else. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, maybe even a bear. I lay back down, but it took me a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was wet from last night's rain, and I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. Not boots, not animal tracks, bare feet. They led from the trees to the side of the cabin, then stopped near the porch before turning back. The prints were deep, meaning whoever made them was heavy. They weren't mine, I checked. Mine had tread marks. These were smooth, naked. I looked around the trees, scanning for movement, but nothing was there. The whole forest felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. I went inside and locked the door, even though the lock was just a simple latch. I wasn't taking any chances. That day, I kept busy. I checked the tools, made sure nothing was missing, and even chopped some wood to pass the time. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked toward the trees, I expected to see someone standing there. I never did. That night was worse. I had just started dozing off when I heard it again. The sound of something moving outside, but this time, it was closer, right outside the cabin. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Then something scraped against the wall. Long, slow, deliberate. I sat up, heart pounding. The flashlight was next to me, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Instead, I listened, trying to figure out what was out there. A thud, then another. It was coming from the porch. I slowly reached for my bag, where I kept my knife. I wasn't planning on using it, but I felt better holding something. Then something tapped the window. Not hard, just a light, careful tap. I couldn't see anything through the fogged-up glass, but I knew someone was standing there, watching me. I stayed completely still, gripping the knife so tightly my hand started to cramp. The tapping came again, softer this time, like whoever was outside wanted to see how I'd react. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Then finally the sound stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care what Eric said. I'd tell him someone was messing with the place, and that was that. I grabbed my bag, threw it in the truck, and started the engine. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, right outside the cabin, was a pile of rocks. Small, smooth stones, stacked neatly on top of each other. That pile hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had been here. Someone had watched me all night. I didn't waste another second. I threw the truck into gear and tore out of there, the tires slipping on the mud as I sped down the trail. When I finally reached town, I called Eric from a gas station payphone. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You need to leave it alone." "What?" I asked. "Don't go back," he said. "I should have told you before, but the guy who owned that cabin before me, he disappeared, left all his stuff behind. Cops never found him." I hung up without saying another word. I never went back. Neither did Eric. A few months later, he sold the property. I don't know who bought it, and I don't care. All I know is that somewhere, deep in those woods, something is still out there, watching, waiting, and it's not alone. It was late October when I took the job. A man I knew from a few years back, Henry, called me up and asked if I was interested in doing some off-the-book security work for a hunting lodge up in Montana. It wasn't a real lodge, not in the way you'd think. More like an old, run-down cabin in the middle of nowhere, owned by some rich guy from out of state who only used it during the peak of hunting season. Henry told me it paid well, way better than my usual gigs, and all I had to do was watch the place for a few weeks, make sure no one broke in, and keep an eye out for trespassers. I'd done work like this before, mostly for vacation homes or empty rental properties. I was used to long nights, isolation, and the occasional troublemaker trying to squat in an empty place. It wasn't anything new to me. What made this job different was the location. This cabin was at least a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, deep in the forest, past miles of dirt roads that barely showed up on a map. The kind of place where if your truck broke down, you were walking a long time before you saw another person. I wasn't thrilled about that part, but the money was good. Too good to pass up. The drive out there was rough. My truck rattled over the uneven dirt road, kicking up dust and loose rocks. I kept looking at my fuel gauge, hoping I wouldn't need to go back into town anytime soon. The trees were dense, towering over the narrow road like they wanted to swallow it whole. It had rained a few days earlier, and I could see puddles and wet patches of mud in the low spots. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. It was a small place, built decades ago but still solid. Thick log walls, a sloped tin roof, a wraparound porch that had seen better days. There was a shed off to the side, its door hanging open slightly, revealing a stack of firewood inside. A rusted old generator sat near the back of the cabin, next to a propane tank that looked like it hadn't been filled in years. I parked my truck, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of old wood and dust hitting me immediately. Inside, the place was simple, a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a single bedroom in the back. There were no modern appliances, no TV, and no cell service. A two-way radio sat on the kitchen counter, probably meant for emergency calls if I needed help. I spent the rest of the evening settling in, checking the locks, and making sure everything was in order. There wasn't much to do besides read or sit by the fire, so I took out a book and tried to pass the time. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trees. The sound of branches scraping against the roof made it feel like something was moving around just outside the cabin. That night, I barely slept. The sounds of the forest were different from what I was used to. Every so often, I'd hear something out in the trees, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But when I looked outside, there was nothing. Just darkness and the shifting silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. The next few days were quiet. I'd walk the perimeter in the mornings, making sure everything was as it should be. The only tracks I saw in the dirt were my own, and the only signs of life were the occasional deer passing through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. On the third night, I heard it, a noise just outside the cabin. Not the wind, not an animal. Something walking, slow and deliberate. Heavy footsteps in the dirt. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. I reached for my rifle, gripping it tight as I listened. Then a knock at the door. A single knock, followed by silence. I didn't move. I just sat there, listening, my pulse thudding in my ears. Another knock, this time softer. I waited, barely breathing. Then something spoke. A voice, low and broken, like someone trying to force words out of a throat that wasn't meant to speak. "Let me in." I nearly pulled the trigger right there. The voice wasn't normal. It sounded human, but wrong. Stretched, distorted, like a bad recording played back too slowly. I stayed still, gripping the rifle, waiting for whoever or whatever it was to go away. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard footsteps retreating into the woods. Slow, unsteady, something moving back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I stepped outside, rifle ready. The ground outside the door was disturbed. Deep, uneven footprints leading from the tree line to the porch. The prints weren't right. They looked almost human but longer, the toes spread too wide, like whoever made them wasn't used to walking on two legs. I followed them a few yards into the woods before they disappeared. Just stopped, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. That was when I made my decision. I packed my things, grabbed my gear, and loaded up my truck. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Something was standing at the edge of the tree line. Tall, thin, its limbs too long for its body. Watching me, I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just drove. I never took another job like that, and I never went back to that cabin. I had never thought much about my boss's cabin. It sat out in the woods, a good 30 minutes from the main road, and I had only ever been out there once during the daytime. He'd mentioned it a few times at work, how he used it to get away, how he liked the peace and quiet, but beyond that, I didn't care. It was just another cabin in the middle of nowhere. That changed one night when I took the back roads home. I had been working late, later than usual. The office was nearly empty by the time I left. The parking lot quiet except for a few cars that belonged to the night staff. I was exhausted, running on caffeine and a half-eaten sandwich I barely remembered eating. The usual highway home had construction, which meant detours, which meant I could either sit in bumper-to-bumper traffic or take the longer way through the back roads. I chose the back roads. The further I drove, the darker it got. The kind of dark that made the headlights feel useless. The rain didn't help either. It wasn't heavy, just enough to mist up the windshield, make the road slick. I had to drive slower than usual, my tires sliding slightly on the curves. I knew this road. I had taken it before, years ago. It was long and winding, cutting through thick trees on both sides. There were no streetlights, no signs of life, just asphalt, rain, and endless black forest. About halfway through, I passed my boss's cabin. It was hard to miss. Even in the rain, I could see the long driveway leading up to it. The cabin itself sat back a ways, tucked behind the trees, but there was a break in the woods where I could see just enough to know something wasn't right. The porch light was on. That was strange. My boss wasn't supposed to be there. He was out of town for a business trip. I knew that for a fact because I had helped him book his flight earlier that week. He wasn't coming back until Sunday, yet the light was on. I slowed the car just a little. The rain pattered against the windshield, my wipers scraping against the glass. I tried to get a better look as I passed. The front door was cracked open. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just the strangeness of it. The door hanging open, the porch light spilling out into the night, the knowledge that no one was supposed to be there. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he had forgotten to close it all the way before he left. Maybe the wind had pushed it open, but the wind wasn't strong, and the rain wasn't enough to make it budge. I kept driving. The further I got, the more I felt it, that feeling in my gut. I told myself it was just paranoia, just exhaustion, but something gnawed at me. After another mile, I pulled over. The car idled, rain tapping against the roof. I gripped the steering wheel, thinking I could just keep going, pretend I didn't see anything, go home and forget about it. But what if someone had broken in? I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. My boss wasn't a friend, but he wasn't a bad guy either. I had worked for him for years. If someone was in his cabin, if something was wrong, I couldn't just ignore it. I turned the car around. The drive back felt longer. The road seemed darker. My hands were tense on the wheel. When I reached the driveway, I stopped at the entrance, headlights illuminating the path up to the cabin. Nothing moved. I shut the engine off. The rain was lighter now, barely more than a drizzle. I stepped out, gravel crunching under my shoes. The trees loomed on either side, thick and silent. As I walked up the driveway, I kept my eyes on the porch. The light was still on. The door still cracked. The air smelled damp, wood, rain, earth. It was cold. Not freezing, but enough to make my skin prickle. I reached the steps. From up close, the door looked worse than I had thought. It wasn't just cracked open. It was slightly off the hinges, like someone had forced it. The wood around the lock was splintered. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed to leave, but I stepped inside. The cabin was dark except for the porch light spilling in. The air smelled stale, like dust and damp wood. The living room was small, just a couch, a coffee table, a few chairs. Everything looked normal. Then I saw the footprints.
Wet footprints.
Leading further inside. They weren't mine. I stood still, listening. The rain against the roof. The wind outside. Then something shifted in the back room. I turned, heart hammering. I could barely see down the hall, but something was there. A shape. I didn't stay to find out. I turned and ran. My feet slammed against the floorboards, the sound echoing through the cabin. I hit the porch steps hard, nearly slipping. The gravel skidded under my shoes as I ran for the car. I didn't look back. I yanked the door open, scrambled inside. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. I turned it again. Nothing. The rain dripped down the windshield, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. I glanced back at the cabin. The porch light flickered. Then, in the darkness of the doorway, something moved. A shadow, a figure, watching me. My breath caught. I turned the key again, harder. The engine roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I threw it into reverse, tires spinning, gravel flying. The car jerked as I backed onto the road. I hit the gas. The road blurred past, my hands tight on the wheel. My chest felt like it was caving in, my lungs burning. I didn't stop, not until I was miles away. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a gas station. My hands were still shaking. I called the police. They found the cabin empty. No signs of forced entry.
No footprints.
No one inside. But the door had been broken. And my boss? He never left for his trip. They found his body in the woods behind the cabin. He had been dead for days. It was late October when my cousin and I went to stay in an old cabin in the woods of Northumberland. He had rented it out for the weekend, hoping for a quiet retreat from our usual lives. The plan was simple: hike during the day, relax in the evenings, and enjoy the crisp autumn air. But the weekend turned into something neither of us could have expected. The cabin itself was isolated, deep in a stretch of woodland that barely saw visitors. The nearest town was about an hour's drive away, and the roads leading up to it were rough and winding. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The place was old, weathered wood, an overgrown path leading to the entrance, and a heavy wooden door that groaned when we pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp timber and the lingering smoke of past fires. It was basic but functional. A fireplace, a couple of old chairs, a wooden table, and 2 small bedrooms at the back. No electricity, no running water, just a generator for light and an old pump outside for fresh water. The first night was uneventful. We cooked on the small gas stove, talked about work, family, and the usual things. The wind howled outside, making the trees creak. At one point, I thought I heard something moving outside, slow, deliberate steps crunching on leaves. But when I looked through the small window, there was nothing but darkness. The next day, we set off early for a hike. The forest was thick, the ground damp from the night's rain. We followed a narrow path that wound deeper into the woods. The silence was unsettling. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the sound of our boots against the wet earth. After a couple of hours, we reached a clearing with an old stone wall, half collapsed and covered in moss. It looked like the remains of an old building, but there was something odd about it. The ground nearby had been disturbed, as if someone had been digging. We didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was just animals. As we turned to head back, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the mud. Not ours, but someone else's. They were deep, suggesting whoever made them was carrying something heavy. They led towards the trees and vanished into the undergrowth. We stood there for a moment, uneasy, before deciding to keep walking. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere felt different. The air inside was colder than it should have been. We had left the door locked, but something felt off. I checked my bag, which I had left on the table, and found it slightly open. Nothing was missing, but the idea that someone had been inside while we were away made my stomach tighten. My cousin laughed it off, saying we were just tired and overthinking things, but I could tell he was just as unsettled. That night, I struggled to sleep. The wind had died down, leaving only silence. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside. Not an animal, not the wind. Someone walking just beyond the cabin walls. I froze, listening, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped near the front door. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. No knock, no attempt to open the door. Just the presence of someone standing there, unmoving. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. I stayed awake until morning, every nerve on edge. The next day, we found something that made our blood run cold. Just outside the cabin, near the front steps, was a single boot print large, deep in the damp soil. Whoever had been outside last night had stood there for a long time. And they weren't just passing by. They had been watching. We decided to cut the trip short. Packing up quickly, we locked the cabin and started the long drive back. The entire time, I felt like we were being watched, like whoever had been out there knew we were leaving. A few days later, my cousin called me. He had looked up the history of the cabin. Turns out, a man had gone missing there years ago. A hunter who had never returned from a trip into the woods. His body was never found. We never went back. The rain had started an hour before my shift began, coming down in sheets against the roof of my car as I pulled into the dirt lot. It was a cold, steady downpour, soaking into the earth, turning the narrow road into a thick stretch of mud that made my tires slip as I slowed to a stop. My wipers had been working hard all the way up here, but it was no use. The night was dark, the storm clouds smothering any moonlight, and the only thing guiding me was the faint glow of my headlights bouncing off the wet trees. I worked security for a private construction company. They had been building something out here, deep in the woods, away from any main roads. I never asked what exactly. It wasn't my job to care. My job was to sit in a small, old cabin just outside the site and keep an eye on the place overnight. A few weeks ago, some local kids had broken in, messing with equipment and stealing tools, so the company hired a guard to be here at night. That guard was me. I cut the engine, grabbed my rain jacket from the passenger seat, and took a deep breath before stepping out into the storm. The rain hit me immediately, cold and heavy, soaking through my sleeves before I even reached the trunk. I pulled out my flashlight and work bag, then locked the car behind me. The place was silent, except for the rain drumming against the cabin's roof and the trees swaying in the wind. The cabin itself was nothing special, just a small, one-room structure built decades ago, probably used by hunters back in the day. It smelled like damp wood and old cigarettes inside, and the wind had forced a bit of rain under the door, leaving a dark puddle on the floorboards. I shut the door behind me and set my bag on the rickety wooden table against the wall. The only real source of light was an old overhead bulb connected to the generator, which I had to start manually every shift. I walked to the back of the cabin, flipped the switch, and after a few cranks, the generator sputtered to life. The dull yellow light flickered once, then held steady. I set my flashlight down and took off my wet jacket, shaking off the cold before settling into the chair by the window. The site itself was about 100 yards away, just past the clearing. A dirt path led from the cabin to the construction area, where they were in the middle of putting up some kind of facility. Large metal beams stood half-finished in the muddy ground, scaffolding rising around them like the bones of something that had never fully formed. The whole area was surrounded by a thick tree line, making it impossible to see anything past the site. I had 8 hours to go. The first couple of hours passed without anything unusual. The rain kept falling, steady and heavy, and I sat with my thermos of coffee, watching the trees sway in the wind. The routine was simple: check the area every hour, make sure no one had come snooping around, then go back inside and wait for morning. I had done this shift for 2 weeks already, and nothing had ever happened. Around midnight, I grabbed my flashlight and went out for my first round. The rain had turned the ground into thick mud, and my boots sank slightly with every step. I made my way down the path, shining my light over the site, scanning the equipment and the half-built structure for any movement. Nothing, just the wind and the rain. I circled around the back, my beam cutting through the dark, but there was no sign of anything out of place. By the time I made it back to the cabin, my jacket was soaked through again. I pulled it off, wrung out the sleeves, and sat back down. Another hour passed. The rain didn't let up. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the storm, a rustling sound coming from the trees behind the cabin. I turned in my chair, listening. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but something about it felt off. It was too deliberate, too steady, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up. I walked to the window, peering out into the dark. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches dripping with rain, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I waited, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't an animal. Animals moved erratically, stopping and starting. This was different, slow, careful steps pushing through the wet leaves and mud. I reached for my radio, but there was no one to call. I was alone out here.
No backup.
No one on the other end of the line. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and opened the door. The cold hit me immediately. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, sending rain sideways into my face as I stepped out onto the porch. I shined my light into the woods, sweeping it back and forth. Nothing. I took a step forward, my boots sinking into the mud. The wind carried another sound this time, something deeper. A low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the wet ground. I took another step. The beam of my flashlight shook slightly in my grip. I swept it across the tree line again, my breath coming out in quick, cold puffs. Then I saw it, a figure, just past the trees. It was standing completely still, half hidden by the branches. I froze. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my pulse hammering. The wind howled around me, and for a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, the figure took a step back, and another, and then it was gone, swallowed by the trees. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, my light still pointed at the empty space where it had stood. My mind raced. Who the hell was out here in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm? I forced myself to move, stepping back onto the porch, my eyes never leaving the trees. I went inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking, I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the window watching, but the figure never came back. Morning finally came, the rain slowing to a drizzle as the sky lightened. My shift was over. I waited until the construction crew arrived before stepping out of the cabin. The site manager gave me a nod as he walked past, but I barely heard him. I was still thinking about the night before. I made my way to my car, glancing once more at the tree line before getting in. Whoever had been out there, they had wanted me to see them, and that thought stayed with me long after I had left the site behind. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had come to the cabin for a simple weekend getaway, to get away from the grind of the city. I'd always been drawn to the quiet of nature, the way everything slows down in the woods. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, and there was something calming about the way the sun filtered through the branches. I had found the cabin on a rental site, an old, isolated place in the middle of nowhere. It was just what I needed: remote, quiet, and far from any distractions. I drove up that Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky, the roads winding through the forest like something out of a movie. I had the whole weekend planned out, hiking, reading, and just enjoying the peace. The first night was peaceful. I settled in, unpacked my things, and started a fire. The air had the familiar chill of autumn, and I wrapped myself in a blanket on the old couch. The cabin itself was small, but cozy. A little rundown, maybe, but that only added to the charm. I could hear the occasional rustle of animals in the distance, but nothing unusual. The second day, things took a strange turn. I had been out hiking for a few hours, just exploring the nearby trails. The woods were dense, the trees thick with leaves that had begun to change color. It was beautiful, but also incredibly quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you usually get in nature, but the unsettling kind. The kind where you feel like something is watching you. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I walked deeper into the woods, I started to notice something odd. There were broken branches, snapped in a way that didn't seem natural. Something had been through there recently, but it wasn't just the broken branches. There were signs of something else too. Deep, heavy footprints in the mud. Too large for a deer, too erratic for a bear. And then there were the strange, dark stains on the ground. Fresh blood, it seemed, but I couldn't make out what kind of animal it was from. I turned back, my pace quickening, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. The woods felt different on the way back. The air had changed, heavy and thick, like the calm before a storm. When I got back to the cabin, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had just wandered too far. But as I walked into the cabin, the strange feeling didn't leave. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, making the old wooden walls creak and groan. I tried to distract myself, putting some water on the stove for tea, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. That night, things got worse. Around midnight, I was woken up by a sound, soft at first, like something tapping on the window. I lay there, still in the dark, listening. It was faint, but definitely there. A tapping sound, steady, deliberate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or a tree branch brushing against the glass. But then I heard something else. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking just outside the cabin, carefully avoiding the spots that would creak. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just another hiker, maybe someone lost in the woods. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. There was something off about it. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I stayed absolutely still, holding my breath. I heard the doorknob turn, just slightly, like someone was testing the door. The knob rattled again, this time harder. It wasn't locked, but I had never thought to lock it. Who would, out here in the middle of nowhere? The silence that followed was unbearable. I don't know how long I lay there, listening, waiting. Finally, the footsteps moved away. I didn't dare move, not until I was sure. But after a long time, everything outside was quiet again. I decided I wasn't going to sit there any longer. I grabbed my phone, which thankfully still had a little charge, and tried to call the authorities, but there was no signal. I couldn't get through. I stood by the window for what felt like hours, watching the porch, hoping I would see someone or hear something to explain what had happened. But nothing came. The night dragged on, the wind howling louder as the storm approached. By the time the sun finally came up, I was exhausted. I barely slept, but the strange feeling that had plagued me the night before had not left. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed up my things, gathered my gear, and left the cabin as quickly as I could. I didn't even stop to check the area outside. I just wanted to get out of there. But as I was loading the car, something caught my eye. It was just a flash, a movement in the woods, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. I wasn't alone. Someone or something was watching me from the trees. I quickly got in the car and slammed the door, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove off, not even once. I just wanted to get away, as far away as possible from that cabin, from the woods, from whatever had been out there. As I drove down the winding road, trying to calm my nerves, I spotted something ahead, something that made my heart skip a beat. A figure, standing by the side of the road. I slowed the car, unsure of what I was seeing. The figure was tall, hunched slightly, and covered in dark, ragged clothing. It stood still, unmoving, watching me as I approached. I wanted to stop, to ask if it needed help, but something inside me screamed to keep going. There was no way in hell I was stopping. I floored the gas pedal, not daring to look in the rearview mirror as I passed by. Eventually, the figure disappeared from my sight, and I kept driving. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just some lost hiker or a hunter, but after everything that had happened, I didn't care to find out. I just wanted to leave that place behind. It wasn't until I got home, safe and sound, that I had the nerve to look back through the photos I'd taken during my hike. Most of them were normal, just pictures of the trees and the sky, but there was one picture that sent chills down my spine. It was a shot of the trail I had been walking on, just a normal shot. But in the background, barely visible, was a figure. The same figure I had seen by the side of the road. It was standing in the woods, not far from the trail, watching me. The photo had been taken long before I had seen the figure on the road. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in the photo, the figure's eyes were wide open, and they were staring straight at me. The heavy rain beat against the small wooden cabin, the kind you'd expect to see tucked away in the dense forest far from civilization. I had been staying there for a few days now, alone, keeping to myself and trying to shake off the fatigue that had settled in after months of city life. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to unwind, but something about this place never felt quite right. It was a small cabin, just enough room for one person to stay. The dim light of a single lamp flickered in the corner as I unpacked my things. A bed, a stove, a table, and a few chairs, nothing fancy but functional. The woods around it were thick, untamed, and the air had a chill that never quite went away, even in the middle of summer. The kind of chill that made you feel like you weren't alone. The first couple of days were fine. I went for long walks in the woods, taking in the fresh air and the silence. The stillness was almost suffocating, but in a good way, like it was forcing me to slow down. I didn't see much of anything. The trees stretched high, their branches reaching for the sky, casting long, eerie shadows even in broad daylight. It wasn't until the third night that things started to change. It had rained most of the day, and by the time night came, the ground was soft, squelching with each step I took. I sat in the cabin, my feet up on the small coffee table, a book in my hands that I barely paid attention to. The storm outside had grown more intense, the wind howling, rattling the windows. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, except that something in the air felt thick, heavy. I heard a rustle outside. It was faint at first, barely perceptible over the noise of the storm. But it was there, a quick shuffle of leaves. I stood up and moved to the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I peered out into the darkness. Nothing, just the trees, bent and swaying in the wind. I brushed it off, thinking it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or something else that roamed the woods at night. I settled back into my chair, trying to focus on my book, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave. It was as if I was being watched. The silence in the cabin seemed to grow louder the longer I sat there. Another rustle, this time louder, closer. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, but my gut told me otherwise. I walked cautiously toward the door, peering out into the dark. The rain blurred everything, making it hard to see, but something moved in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light from the cabin. It was large, maybe too large for any animal I had seen in these woods. My breath caught in my throat. The thing moved again. It wasn't like any animal I had ever seen. It wasn't the way a bear would move or the way a wolf would stalk its prey. No, this was something different, something unnatural. My hands trembled as I reached for the flashlight on the table. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and pointed the beam into the trees. Nothing. The silence returned. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to calm my racing heart. Then, without warning, I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of something shuffling through the underbrush, moving swiftly. My eyes darted around, but I still couldn't see anything. The beam of my flashlight flickered and died. I froze. The flashlight was supposed to be new. It had just been charged before I left for this trip. I cursed under my breath, my hands fumbling for the backup batteries I had packed. The wind howled again, and I heard the sound of something moving, closer this time. I quickly replaced the batteries, my eyes never leaving the dark woods in front of me. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the shadows, tall and hunched, moving between the trees with a disturbing kind of grace. But as it stepped into the faint glow of the light, I could see it clearly. It wasn't a bear or a wolf or anything natural. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. But there was something wrong. His limbs were too long, too thin, and his skin, pale, almost sickly, seemed to stretch unnaturally over his bones. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see his eyes wide, dark, almost unnatural, like they were too large for his face. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, but I managed to stay on my feet. The man-thing didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, watching me. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, my entire body frozen with fear. Then it did move. Slowly, deliberately, it took one step toward me and another and another. Its steps were silent, as if it was floating above the ground. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. And then it spoke, not in words. There was no voice, but I heard it, somehow, in my mind, a terrible guttural noise like it was trying to communicate in a way that was beyond human understanding. I backed up slowly, my eyes never leaving the figure. It was closer now, close enough for me to see the unnatural bend in its legs, like its knees had been reversed, as if it had no place being on two legs at all. Its long fingers reached out, scraping against the bark of a nearby tree, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The rain was coming down harder now, the ground slick beneath my feet as I sprinted toward the cabin. The door slammed behind me, and I bolted it shut. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. I didn't know what it was or why it was here, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't human. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, jumping at every little noise, convinced it was out there. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't even think straight. I just waited, hoping the storm would pass, hoping the thing outside would go away. But it didn't. As the night dragged on, I heard the scratching again, this time on the walls of the cabin, like something was trying to get in. It was close, so close. I huddled on the floor, clutching a heavy iron skillet, waiting for it to stop. By morning, the scratching stopped. The rain had let up, and the world outside was eerily quiet. I didn't dare open the door at first. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. Finally, I took a deep breath and opened the door, my eyes scanning the woods carefully. There was no sign of the creature. Nothing. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my things, packed up as quickly as I could, and left. I wasn't staying another night in that cabin. Whatever I had seen out there wasn't just some wild animal. It was something worse, something I didn't have the words for. And as I drove away, the feeling of being watched never left. When I finally reached the nearest town, I told the locals what happened. They were silent for a long time before one of them spoke up. "Sounds like you saw one of them," he said. "A skinwalker." The words sent a chill down my spine. But I didn't argue. I didn't need to know anymore. Some things are better left alone. I never expected to find myself alone in the woods of France. I had come here with the idea of escaping the chaos of city life. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, something to recharge my batteries, a break from the constant hum of urban existence. But that calm, peaceful weekend slowly morphed into a nightmare. It was the fall of 2022 when I drove out to the countryside. My car had broken down just outside a small village, and the nearest mechanic was a few miles away. I had planned on staying in a little rented cabin on the outskirts of the village. The place was isolated but comfortable, a small wooden structure nestled in the woods. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The air had a crisp, cool bite to it, and the smell of pine trees filled my lungs. The cabin was charming, with its rough-hewn wood and a thin layer of moss covering the roof. There was no one around, just a few birds flying overhead and the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees. It felt like the kind of place you would find in a dream, peaceful and untouched by the world. I unpacked my things, unloaded the car, and started a fire in the small wood stove. The warmth from the fire spread through the cabin, making the wooden walls creak slightly. I was enjoying the solitude, the silence, the feeling of being away from everything. I had no intention of doing anything but resting for the weekend, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The first odd thing happened that evening. I was sitting by the fire, sipping on a glass of wine, when I heard a faint sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, a rustling, almost like footsteps. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably an animal. After all, I was deep in the woods. But then the rustling grew louder. It wasn't an animal. Someone or something was out there. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the sound persisted, moving closer to the cabin. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered through the small window by the door. There was nothing out there, no movement, no shape, no signs of life. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a chilling presence in the air. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing strange sounds, soft creaks and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, but there was an unnerving sense of silence surrounding the cabin, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. The next day, I decided to head into the village. The mechanic would need a few hours to fix my car, so I had no choice but to pass the time. As I walked through the village, I noticed that it seemed deserted. Not a single person was out and about. The streets were quiet, the shops closed. It was as if the entire village had disappeared overnight. I found the local shopkeeper, an elderly woman with silver hair, sitting behind a counter. When I asked her about the quietness, she gave me a strange look. "People here, they don't like strangers," she said, her voice low and cautious. Her words unsettled me. I thanked her, left the shop, and made my way back to the cabin. The mechanic would be ready soon, but something about the village felt off, like it was hiding something. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by eyes hidden in the shadows. That night, I stayed inside the cabin, doors locked and curtains drawn. The wind had picked up again, and the sound of rustling outside returned. This time, it was more pronounced, more deliberate. The footsteps seemed to circle the cabin, moving slowly, as if whatever was out there was waiting for me to react. I stood by the window, my hands pressed against the cool glass, peering into the dark. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the world below in near-complete darkness. Then, as if on cue, I saw a figure. It was a silhouette, tall and thin, standing motionless just beyond the edge of the woods. The figure was staring directly at the cabin, unmoving, unblinking. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I watched it for what felt like hours, but it didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me. My mind raced. I couldn't just stay here. I had to do something. Slowly, I backed away from the window and grabbed the nearest object, a heavy iron skillet from the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I couldn't just ignore this. I had to know what it was. I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The cold air hit me like a slap, and the trees around me swayed, their branches creaking under the weight of the wind. I looked around, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but the figure was gone. There was no one there. My eyes darted back and forth, my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't understand. The isolation, the strange quiet, and the ominous presence of the figure. All of it seemed to be building toward something I wasn't prepared for. I turned back to the cabin, deciding to lock myself inside for the rest of the night. But just as I reached the door, I heard something behind me. A sound, sharp and sudden, like the snap of a twig underfoot. My breath hitched. Someone was out there. I spun around, gripping the skillet tightly in my hands. But there was no one there. The woods were empty, silent once again. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't care about the car anymore. I just wanted to get out of the woods, away from whatever strange force was lurking in the shadows. But as I started packing, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, this time unmistakable, moving through the trees. I grabbed my bag and rushed out the door, but when I stepped outside, there was nothing there. No sign of anyone, just the emptiness of the forest. I stayed at the cabin for another hour, my mind spinning, unsure of what to do next. Then I saw something on the doorstep. It was a small, weathered piece of paper, folded carefully. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and read the message. "Leave. It's not safe for you here." The handwriting was jagged, hurried, like it had been written in fear. My heart raced as I realized what it meant. Someone else had been watching me, and they were telling me to leave. But who and why? I left that day, driving through the winding roads and past the now quiet village. As I left the woods behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. That figure, the footsteps, the warning. None of it made sense, and yet it all felt terrifyingly real. I never went back to that cabin. It's been years since that weekend, but I can still remember the strange quiet of those woods, the oppressive stillness that seemed to close in on me. I never told anyone what happened, but sometimes, when I'm alone in a room with the lights off, I wonder if someone is still out there, waiting in the shadows. And I can't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't supposed to leave after all. It was the fall of 2018, the kind of year where the air had just enough chill in it to let you know winter was coming. But the trees still hung heavy with leaves that swirled in the wind like they were about to let go. I'd been to my cousin Andy's cabin dozens of times before, but this trip felt different, like something wasn't quite right. The cabin sat tucked away in the dense woods of Michigan, far enough from the nearest town to make you feel isolated, but not so far that you couldn't find your way back. The place had always been a retreat, a place for the family to escape the noise of the world. No internet, no cell service, just the sounds of nature and the crackle of a fire. I was 30 years old when I went this time, a couple of months after Andy had passed. The cabin had been left to him, but with his sudden death, it was up to his brother Mark to decide what to do with it. I hadn't been back since Andy's funeral, and Mark had decided to sell the cabin. But for one last weekend, he invited me to stay there. He wasn't much for reminiscing, but I think he needed the company. The drive there had been quiet. I was alone in the car, the radio barely cutting through the silence, my thoughts bouncing around between memories of Andy and Mark's decision. The trees were starting to look different now. The warm colors of late summer had faded into the bare, grayish hues of autumn, and there was a lingering overcast that seemed to press in from every direction. I pulled up to the cabin in the late afternoon. The air was sharp and biting, the kind of cold that creeps in even when you're bundled up. The gravel crunching beneath my boots echoed too loudly in the empty space, and I felt a strange unease in my chest. Maybe it was just the quiet, or maybe it was the cabin itself, but something felt off. It wasn't the cabin's fault, though. It had always been just as I remembered. A small, weathered place with faded wood, a porch swing that creaked in the wind, and a rusted-out mailbox by the driveway. But standing there, looking at it from the outside, something seemed different. I couldn't put my finger on it. I stepped inside, the old door groaning as I pushed it open. The smell hit me first. Wood, dust, and something faintly musty. The inside of the cabin was still familiar, yet it felt different. Maybe it was because I hadn't been here in a while, but the air seemed too still. The fireplace was cold, and the dim light filtering through the dusty windows didn't help. The place was empty, save for the furniture and the untouched items left behind. The place was a time capsule, frozen in a moment when Andy had been alive. I set my bags down by the couch and surveyed the space. The living room was cozy, with a few chairs around the fireplace and a bookshelf stocked with old novels. There was a worn rug on the floor and a few framed photos on the walls, many of them of the family, mostly from when I was younger. A small kitchen area was off to the side, with an old wood-burning stove and a rickety table. It felt like I could just breathe and it would all come back to me. The laughter, the warmth of family meals, the sound of rain tapping on the roof at night. But those memories felt distant, hazy, like they belonged to someone else now. I was here for only a couple of days, and the first few hours were spent unpacking and going through some old boxes that Mark had left for me. It didn't take long before the sun started setting, and the silence began to feel oppressive. The only sounds now were the occasional rustle of branches against the cabin and the creaks of the old wood as it settled. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the darkening woods outside. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but there it was, just beyond the tree line. Figure, person standing still watching the cabin. The silhouette was hard to make out in the dimming light, but the figure didn't move. It was too still, too quiet. I stared at it for a long time, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Maybe it was a hunter or someone passing through, though why anyone would be this far out in the woods at this hour was beyond me. Maybe it was just a deer, its shape distorted by the trees. But I knew deep down it wasn't any of those things. My gut was telling me something was wrong. I stood up, my legs shaking slightly. The last thing I wanted to do was go outside, but curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking underfoot. The air had grown colder, biting into my skin as I shined the beam of light into the trees. Nothing. The figure was gone. I stayed out there for a few minutes, scanning the darkness, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. The night grew deeper, and the woods around me were silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to push the feeling out of my mind. It was probably just someone passing by, I thought. Maybe a hiker or someone else lost in the woods. The hours ticked by. I ate a quick dinner, read a little, and went to bed early, hoping sleep would erase the strange feeling in my gut. But sleep didn't come. The cabin felt too quiet. The wind outside picked up, whistling through the cracks in the walls, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should be. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building. It wasn't until around midnight that I heard it. A knock. 3 knocks, sharp and deliberate. My heart skipped. I froze, my blood running cold. The knock had come from the back door. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. There it was again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp, even knocks. I couldn't bring myself to move, to open the door. Whoever it was could just be some lost person, but why the back door? Why not the front? The knocking continued for what felt like an eternity. Then suddenly it stopped. I listened. The silence returned. The house felt heavier now, like it was holding its breath. I waited for a few minutes, and then I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I knew then that whoever it was wasn't lost. I didn't know what to do. I was a good ways from the nearest neighbor, and there was no cell service here. It was just me in the dark with whoever or whatever was outside. The sound of footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, coming closer to the window where I was sitting. The light from my flashlight danced on the wall as I tried to peer through the cracks in the blinds. A shadow moved past the window, then stopped. I was sure whoever it was had seen me sitting there, just waiting for something, anything to happen. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but my body refused to obey. The footsteps moved away again, and for a moment, I thought it might all be over. But then, without warning, the back door rattled. Not from the wind, but from someone or something trying to get inside. The handle jiggled, the sound of metal grinding against metal cutting through the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. The door rattled again. And then, nothing. Silence. I didn't know what to do. The door had stopped moving, but I couldn't bring myself to check. The fear held me still, frozen to the spot. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and then, in the dark, in the silence, the tension finally broke. I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. A car, or maybe a truck. It was faint, but it was enough. I waited for it to get closer. The sound grew louder, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The footsteps outside had vanished. I waited in the cabin for hours, not daring to leave. The knocks never came again, and by morning, I was exhausted but relieved. Whoever had been out there was gone. The rest of the weekend passed without incident. When I left, I locked the door and made sure I hadn't left anything behind. It felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind, but I had to move on. Later, when I spoke to Mark, he mentioned something casually about the cabin being settled, and that it had always been quiet out there. But I didn't ask him any more questions. I didn't want to know. It was just better that way. When I left that place, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over, that the woods held secrets, things that never belonged to us, but that we were foolish enough to venture into. And sometimes, just sometimes, the woods don't let you go. It was the middle of autumn, and I had just wrapped up another grueling week at work. I needed some time to clear my head, so I decided to head up to the old cabin my uncle owned in the remote part of the woods. He had passed away 2 years ago, but the cabin had remained in the family. My parents weren't interested in it, but I had always found comfort in the place. It was far away from the busy city, quiet, and isolated. The weather had been chilly the last few days, but nothing out of the ordinary for this time of year. I packed my car with essentials, clothes, food, a sleeping bag, and a few tools for good measure. The cabin wasn't much. An old wooden structure with a metal roof and a porch that creaked every time you stepped on it. There was no electricity, and only a small wood stove heated the place. Still, it was the perfect escape. The drive up was long and winding, passing through dense trees and rough roads that had been poorly maintained. I'd made this drive countless times as a kid, but now it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, like the whole forest was watching me. The trees seemed to close in around the road, their thick branches blocking out most of the sunlight. I reached the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. It was a beautiful sight, nestled between 2 large oak trees. The cabin seemed to embrace the last rays of light. I unpacked my car and set up inside quickly. I built a fire in the stove, then unpacked my food. I planned on staying for a few days, just long enough to unwind and reconnect with myself. As the night fell, the forest outside seemed to come alive. The wind whistled through the trees, and I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, but there was something unsettling about it. The cabin creaked with every gust of wind, and every time I thought I heard something outside, my heart would race for a split second. I chalked it up to my imagination, but it didn't stop the feeling from creeping in. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It wasn't just the normal howling wind. This felt different, like something was moving with it. The creaking of the cabin grew louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked the windows, making sure the cabin was still secure. Everything was fine, just the trees swaying in the wind, their branches scraping against the walls. I sat down near the fire with my book, trying to distract myself. But then, I heard something that made me freeze. A knock. It wasn't on the door, but on the side of the cabin. The sharp sound of wood being struck. I jumped, and my stomach dropped to my feet. I told myself it was the wind, maybe a branch scraping against the wall. But no, this was too deliberate, too sharp. It wasn't random. I stood up cautiously, my mind racing. I grabbed the flashlight that was next to the door and opened it just a crack, peering out. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the porch and surrounding area. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the eerie stillness of the woods. I closed the door slowly, feeling stupid. There was no one out there, but that knock had felt real. It had felt wrong. I locked the door and settled back into my chair, trying to convince myself it was just an animal or the wind. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to read, but the words on the page blurred as my thoughts kept drifting to that knock. An hour passed, maybe more. I don't know how much time had gone by, but I had finally started to calm down. That's when I heard it again. A knock. This time it was louder, more forceful, and it was definitely coming from the side of the cabin. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I stood up again, more cautiously this time, and grabbed the flashlight. I stepped to the door, my feet light on the wooden floor, trying not to make a sound. I opened the door just enough to peer outside. Nothing, just the wind and the trees. My eyes darted across the yard, scanning the darkness. But everything seemed normal, too normal. I couldn't explain it. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone playing a prank? It was unlikely. I hadn't seen anyone on the road for miles. I was completely alone up here. I closed the door and locked it again, my thoughts in turmoil. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but the knocking had stopped. I sat back down near the stove, staring at the flames as they danced in the small fire. The warmth didn't help my unease. I must have dozed off for a bit because when I opened my eyes, I was suddenly aware of the silence. The wind had stopped. The trees outside were motionless, and the air was unnervingly still. That's when I heard it again. A faint scraping noise. It was coming from inside the cabin. I shot up from my chair, my pulse quickening. It was too dark to see anything clearly, but I knew something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight again and turned it on, shining it around the room. I froze when I saw it. The floorboard near the wall, where the knock had sounded before, was slightly raised. It wasn't much, just a crack, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I hadn't noticed it before. I took a slow step forward, my flashlight aimed at the crack in the floor. There was something underneath it, a faint indentation in the wood. It was like something had pushed up from below, just enough to make the floor give way. I knelt down, my heart pounding in my chest, and gently pressed on the floorboard. With a quiet creak, it gave way slightly, and I pulled it up. Underneath, there was a small space just big enough to fit a hand. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but it wasn't what I saw next. There was a bundle of old, frayed rope. It was tied tightly and had been shoved into the small gap beneath the floor. But there was something else, something that sent a chill up my spine. A piece of paper, folded neatly, hidden inside the rope. I grabbed the paper with shaking hands and unfolded it. The writing was faded, but still legible. "Get out while you can." My throat went dry. My mind raced. Who had left this message? How long had it been there? And why was it hidden under the floor? I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I had to leave. But as I turned to gather my things, the cabin door slammed shut with a deafening bang. My heart stopped. I rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. My mind screamed at me to stay calm, to think clearly, but I couldn't. The knock, the scraping noise, the message. It all made sense now, and none of it was good. I turned around and ran toward the back window, but the glass was covered by thick wooden planks, nailed in place. My only way out was the front door. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't alone in the cabin. I backed away from the door, listening intently for any sounds. I heard nothing. The silence was deafening, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like the walls themselves were closing in around me. I had no choice but to try the door one more time. This time, the door opened. Outside, the woods were still and silent, but I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and ran into the night, not stopping until I reached my car. I didn't look back. The message, the rope, the door. Everything screamed danger, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what would happen next. I drove back down the winding road as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I didn't tell anyone what happened that night. Maybe I was overreacting, maybe not, but one thing was clear. There was something in that cabin, something hidden, something I wasn't meant to find. And as I looked in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there, watching me. It was late October, the chill of early autumn creeping through the trees like a slow-moving fog. I'd been driving for hours, the winding roads of the UK countryside stretching out before me, barely illuminated by my headlights. The air had a sharp bite to it, a sign that winter was approaching. My car rattled over the uneven roads, each bump and jolt reminding me of how far I was from anything resembling civilization. I had rented a cabin for the weekend, far out in the wilds of Northumberland. No phone signal, no neighbors, just me, the trees, and whatever creatures lurked in the shadows. The isolation was part of the appeal. I needed to get away, to be alone with my thoughts. No distractions, just peace and quiet. After passing a few small farms and the occasional ramshackle house, I finally saw the sign for the cabin. The dirt road leading up to it was narrow and barely wide enough for my car, but I managed to squeeze through without getting stuck. The trees on either side of the road grew thick and dense, their branches hanging low like they were reaching out to grab hold of anything that passed. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly what I had imagined. Old, weathered, but sturdy. The kind of place you could picture in an old horror movie, isolated and forgotten by time. The wooden porch creaked underfoot as I stepped out of the car. A faint smell of wood smoke lingered in the air, but there was no sign of life. No lights in the windows, no movement behind the trees. Just silence. I took a deep breath and grabbed my bags. The door was locked, of course, but I had the key hidden under a rock by the steps. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was dark, but the faint glow from my flashlight revealed the worn furniture, the stone fireplace, and the large windows that looked out into the woods. The place had character, but there was a certain emptiness about it, as if it had been abandoned for years. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I relished it. I set down my bags, went to the kitchen, and immediately started a fire in the hearth. The crackling of the logs soon filled the silence, and the warmth spread through the room. I took my time, unpacking and setting up for the night. It was already getting late, and I had no plans to go anywhere. I was going to relax, have a quiet night, and enjoy the solitude. After a quick meal, I settled into the armchair by the fire with a book. The sound of the wind howling outside was comforting in a strange way. It was a perfect night to be inside, far from the worries of the world. But as I read, something began to feel off. It was a subtle feeling at first, just a shift in the atmosphere, like I wasn't quite as alone as I had thought. I tried to shake it off. I was just being paranoid. The wind was picking up, the trees outside creaking in the storm. I focused on the words in my book, forcing myself to concentrate. But the unease lingered. Then I heard it, a faint thud, like something heavy falling to the ground, came from outside, just beyond the porch. I froze, my heart rate picking up. It was so quiet in the cabin that even the smallest noise felt amplified. My eyes flicked to the window, but all I could see were the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I sat there for a moment, straining to listen. Another thud, this one louder than the first. It came from the direction of the woods, just beyond the clearing where the cabin sat. My mind raced. Animals, maybe? A deer? A fox? But no, it didn't sound like an animal. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I stood up slowly, my feet almost silent on the wooden floor. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling slightly. The thought of stepping outside into the dark, unknown woods made my stomach churn, but curiosity pushed me forward. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just being foolish. I opened the door carefully, the hinges creaking in protest. The wind hit me immediately, cold and biting. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, casting long shadows across the ground. Nothing moved. The porch was empty. I scanned the area around me, but there was no sign of anyone. Just the trees, the wind, and the eerie quiet. Then there was another thud. This time it was much closer. I whipped my head around, the flashlight beam flicking over the trees. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. Just a few feet away from the edge of the clearing, something moved. It was a dark figure, hunched over, blending into the shadows. I couldn't make out much, just the shape of it. My heart raced. Who could be out here? There was no road nearby, no other houses for miles. It didn't make sense. I called out, though I'm not sure why. Maybe I was hoping it was just some lost traveler or someone out for a walk. But there was no response, only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I stood frozen for what felt like forever. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if it was waiting. My mind screamed at me to go back inside, to lock the door and never look back. But my feet refused to move. It was only when I heard another loud thud from the figure, closer this time, that I finally snapped out of it. I slammed the door shut behind me, heart hammering in my chest. The warmth of the cabin felt like safety, but it didn't last long. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had just seen, person or something else. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. No one would be crazy enough to venture this far out in the dark, especially on a night like this. I bolted the door and turned all the lights on. The flickering glow of the fire was no longer enough to calm me. I kept my flashlight in hand, shining it across every corner of the room, checking the windows, making sure everything was secure. The cabin felt too quiet now. The silence was suffocating. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every snap of a twig outside made my heart race. I kept expecting to hear that thud again, the sound of footsteps, but it never came. The world outside seemed to hold its breath along with me, waiting for something that never arrived. By morning, the unease had not left. The sun had risen, but the sense of something being wrong still lingered. I had to get out. I had planned to stay the weekend, but after what happened, I couldn't bear another night in that cabin. I packed up my things quickly, hardly taking the time to gather my thoughts. As I stepped outside, the daylight didn't bring the relief I expected. The woods were still silent, too silent. The thuds from the night before echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. The drive back to civilization was long and slow, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't stop until I was far away from the cabin, out of the woods and into the safety of the main roads. I never did find out what I saw that night. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. Maybe it was some lost soul wandering through the woods. But one thing was for sure, I wouldn't be going back to that cabin. And the strange thing, the closer I got to town, the more I realized I wasn't the only one who had seen something. A few weeks later, I heard that the cabin had been rented out to someone else. They never came back either. It was the kind of night you'd look back on and never quite explain to anyone. The kind of night that you remember in the pit of your stomach, a gnawing, unshakable feeling that lingers long after. The cabin I was in that night wasn't anything special. Just a simple wood frame structure tucked deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. The trees loomed heavy against the overcast sky, and the wind outside whispered through the branches, like a forgotten voice from some long-forgotten past. I'd been assigned to take care of this place for a few days. It was supposed to be simple. Check the place, keep the fire going, and make sure nothing was off. A night shift job at a remote cabin was supposed to be quiet, peaceful even, but I'd never been so wrong. The small area around the cabin had been cleared of trees, just enough to allow for a good view of the surrounding woods. The air was crisp, colder than it should have been for late autumn, with a smell of pine and damp earth that seemed to press against the cabin walls. I set up in the main room, the crackling fire in the stone fireplace lighting the space in an orange glow. The walls were lined with old wood paneling, the floors were creaky, and the furnishings were sparse. A single wooden table, a couple of chairs, a rug in front of the fire, and an old leather couch. The small kitchen was tucked off to the side, with a single window overlooking the yard. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find a retired woodsman or someone who wanted to be left alone. The first couple of hours went by quietly enough. The night felt calm, the sort of cold quiet that can only be found in the middle of nowhere. There were no sounds of traffic, no distant voices, just the occasional crack of a branch or the scuttle of small animals outside. It was around midnight when I first noticed it. The feeling, a shift in the atmosphere that you can't quite put into words. It wasn't the usual silence. It was something heavier. I sat up straighter, my attention snapping to the window, but the yard was empty. The trees were just dark, looming silhouettes against the dark sky, their branches creaking in the wind. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, a shift in the air, maybe the house settling. But then I heard something, a sound, soft at first, like a low thud, followed by a scraping noise, faint and deliberate. I froze. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. My breath felt tight in my chest. I glanced toward the window again, expecting to see someone or something moving in the dark, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the shadows. Another sound, closer this time. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the cabin. I stood slowly, my feet cold against the floorboards, as I tried to make out the source of the noise. It was a scratching sound, like nails against the wood. Started low from the corner of the room near the door, and then it moved. Slowly, deliberately. My heart thumped in my chest, and my mouth went dry. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to investigate. I didn't want to move. I felt a primal instinct to stay still, to be as small and silent as possible. But the sound kept going, almost rhythmic, as though something was pacing inside the walls. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, an old iron poker from the fireplace, and I crept toward the door, my eyes glued to the corner where the noise had come from. The air felt thicker now, like the world itself was holding its breath. With every step I took, the sound stopped, only to pick up again a moment later, just out of reach. I was a fool to go toward it, but I couldn't stop myself. It was a mixture of curiosity, fear, and the sheer need to confront whatever it was. I reached the door, the poker gripped tightly in my hands, and slowly pushed it open, half expecting to find something waiting there. Nothing, just the yard, the same empty space outside. No signs of movement, no sounds, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. The hairs on my neck prickled. I stepped outside, trying to steady my breathing. The night air was colder than before, and the wind picked up. It felt like the trees themselves were watching me, their branches swaying in strange, unnatural ways. It was the way the wind sounded, too sharp, too deliberate. I turned back toward the cabin, but something caught my eye. There, near the edge of the yard, a figure, just standing there. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark shape blending into the forest. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then it moved. Slow, deliberate steps toward the cabin. My heart raced. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and rushed back to the fireplace, trying to calm myself. I couldn't hear anything outside now, but I didn't want to go near the window to check. The air felt colder, the space tighter. My pulse was a steady drumbeat in my ears. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't the same. It was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in on me as the fire flickered in the hearth. I glanced toward the door again. Was I being paranoid? I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind, sending my heart into a panic. I wanted to leave. I wanted to get in my truck and drive until I couldn't see the cabin anymore. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. And then it came. A knock, soft, gentle, but unmistakable, right at the door. My breath hitched. There wasn't a soul for miles around. No one could have come up here in this cold, in the middle of the night. The knock came again. I couldn't move. I was frozen to the spot, the poker still in my hand. I stared at the door, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. Was it a trick? Was someone playing a joke on me? My mind spun with possibilities, but none of them made sense. The third knock, louder this time. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the door. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand whoever it was to leave. But nothing came out. It was like my throat had closed up. My instincts told me to keep my distance, to stay out of sight. But I couldn't. I had to know. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and moved toward the door, slowly. My hand reached for the knob, but just as I touched it, the door slammed open, throwing me back onto the floor. The poker slipped from my hand and rolled across the room. I scrambled to my feet, my heart in my throat, but no one was there. The door was wide open, and the yard outside was empty. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees. I looked around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. For a long time, I just stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a dream? Had I imagined the whole thing? But no, something was out there. Something had been watching me. I didn't stay much longer. The next morning, I packed up my things and left before the sun even came up, the image of the empty yard lingering in my mind. I had no explanation.
No answers.
But I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods knew something I didn't, that whatever was out there hadn't left. It was still waiting, and as I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see someone standing in the window of that cabin, just watching me. But no one was there, just the trees, and the empty, haunting silence.